This story starts with a woman cast out by her town. But this isn't a story about shame. It's a story about fear. Because the good people of Redemption Creek weren't just judging Isabella Martinez. They were terrified of her, and the secret she carried was far more dangerous than a baby born of sin. What you're about to hear is a story of how one woman, left to die in the desert, brought down an empire of liars and killers. And it all started the day they threw her out. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, beating down on the dusty street. Isabella clutched her 3-month-old daughter Sophia to her chest. The baby's soft whimpers were lost in the hateful whispers that followed her everywhere. "Look at her," sneered Mrs. Whitmore, the banker's wife. "No shame at all." Isabella's grip tightened on her child. Shame? No. That wasn't what was twisting in her gut. It was fear. A cold, sharp fear that had nothing to do with their judgment. She knew what they were really saying. It wasn't about the baby. It was about the baby's father, the handsome traveling merchant who had whispered promises in the dark and then vanished like a ghost. Except he wasn't a merchant, and he hadn't just vanished. "The council has made its position clear," Dr. Brennan had told her that morning, his eyes full of pity and something else. Something that looked a lot like terror. He was firing her. The last person in town who had shown her kindness was now pushing her away. Everyone was. The seamstress who rented her a room. The baker who sold her stale bread. They all looked at her with the same panicked expression. Get out! Get out before it gets you! Now, standing at the edge of town, she had nowhere left to go. The desert stretched out before her, a vast, empty promise of death. Behind her, the town of Redemption Creek watched, holding its breath, waiting for her to disappear. Isabella turned her back on them, her head held high. She whispered to Sophia, "I will protect you, mi niña, no matter what." She took one step into the wilderness, then another. The desert wind whipped her hair across her face, and it felt like the world was trying to erase her. She didn't know it yet, but she wasn't just walking away from a town. She was walking into a war. And behind her, in the sheriff's office, a portly man named Blake lowered his spyglass. He turned to the banker, Mr. Whitmore, and the cold-eyed preacher, Reverend Morrison. "She's gone," the sheriff said, sweat beading on his forehead. The preacher's lips curled into a thin, cruel smile. "The desert will take care of her, and the secret will die with her." But they were wrong, because secrets don't die. They just wait. And out there, in the vast, deadly quiet of the desert, someone else was watching. Someone who knew Isabella wasn't the problem. She was the key. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving behind a bruised purple twilight. The desert, which had been a furnace by day, was now turning into a block of ice. Isabella shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around herself and Sophia. The baby's cries had weakened to a pathetic whimper. Hunger, cold, fear. They were a three-headed beast hunting them in the darkness. Isabella stumbled on, her body screaming in protest. Every shadow looked like a monster. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper of death. She heard the distant howl of a coyote, and her blood ran cold. This was it. This was where she and her innocent child would die, their bones bleached white under the uncaring moon. She fell to her knees, the sharp rocks tearing at her worn dress. "Please," she sobbed, the tears freezing on her cheeks. "Please, God, help us." And then she saw it, a flicker of light in the distance, a campfire. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her despair. But it was followed immediately by a new wave of fear. Who camps in this God-forsaken stretch of land? Outlaws? Savages? A woman alone with a baby was the most vulnerable creature in the West. Still, what choice did she have? Stay here and freeze, or walk toward the fire and face the unknown? She chose the fire. Creeping closer, she moved like a ghost through the scrub brush. She could see them now. A group of hard-faced men gathered around the flames. Their horses were nearby, saddled and ready, as if they might need to leave at a moment's notice. These were not settlers. These were dangerous men. Her eyes landed on their leader. He sat slightly apart from the others, his shoulders broad, his presence commanding. He had hair as black as a raven's wing and skin the color of burnished copper. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes. His eyes were constantly moving, scanning the darkness. Alert, predatory. She recognized him. He had ridden into Redemption Creek that very afternoon. He and his men had bought supplies, their silence and intensity setting the whole town on edge. She had seen him talking to Sheriff Blake, and the sheriff had looked like a scared rabbit talking to a wolf. They called him Crow. Nathan Crow Feather, a man who belonged to two worlds and was trusted by neither. Half Comanche, half Irish. All dangerous. Was this salvation or a different kind of death? As she watched, frozen by indecision, one of his men spoke. That town's got a mean streak, boss. The way they were treating that girl with the baby, it ain't right. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. They were talking about her. Crow didn't look up from the piece of wood he was carving. I saw, was all he said, his voice a low rumble. A sudden gust of wind cut through Isabella's shawl. Sophia let out a sharp, piercing cry. Every head in the camp snapped in her direction. The silence was absolute. Crow rose to his feet in one fluid, terrifying motion. He wasn't holding the knife he'd been carving with. He was holding a pistol, and it was aimed directly at the shadows where she was hiding. His voice cut through the night, calm and lethal. Show yourself. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. Run. Her mind screamed. Run. But her legs wouldn't move. She was trapped in the gaze of the predator she had stumbled upon. He took a step toward her, his dark eyes seeming to pierce right through the brush, right through her soul. And in his eyes she saw no pity, no sympathy. She saw recognition. He looked at her as if he had been waiting for her all along. With her heart in her throat, Isabella stepped into the flickering firelight. She held Sophia so tightly the baby stirred, her little fist clenching. Every man in the camp was staring at her, their hands hovering near their guns. This was a mistake, a fatal mistake. Crow's pistol remained steady, aimed at her heart. You're a long way from town, he said. His voice was unnervingly calm. They cast me out, Isabella stammered, her voice trembling. I have nowhere to go. His dark eyes swept over her, taking in her tattered dress, her bare feet, the desperation etched onto her face. He glanced at the whimpering bundle in her arms. For a moment she thought she saw something flicker in his expression, something other than cold assessment. He lowered his pistol. The baby needs warmth, he said. It wasn't a question. He turned to his men. Pete, give her a blanket. Carlos, some of that stew. The men moved, their suspicion replaced by a grudging respect. The one called Pete, a grizzled man with a network of scars on his face, handed her a rough wool blanket. Carlos, younger and with kind eyes, gave her a tin bowl of hot rabbit stew. Isabella's stomach cramped with hunger, but she couldn't eat. Not yet. She wrapped the blanket around Sophia first, crooning softly as the baby's whimpers quieted in the sudden warmth. Only then did she take the bowl, her hands shaking so much she nearly spilled it. She sat by the fire, devouring the stew like a wild animal. The men watched her in silence. It was the most uncomfortable meal of her life, but it was also the first real food she'd had in 2 days. When she was done, she looked up at Crow, who was watching her with that same unnerving intensity. Why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why are you helping me? He didn't answer right away. He walked over to his horse and pulled something from his saddlebag. He returned and held it out to her. It was a cloak, but not like any cloak she had ever seen. It was beautifully made, adorned with intricate Comanche beadwork, yet crafted from fine wool traded from the East. It was a thing of two worlds, just like the man who held it. My mother made this, he said quietly. It was meant to provide protection. It seems you need it more than I do. Overwhelmed, she accepted the cloak, its weight and warmth a shocking comfort. She wrapped it around herself and Sophia, the faint scent of sage and leather clinging to the fabric. Thank you, she whispered, tears finally blurring her vision. Don't thank me, he said, his voice turning hard again. I'm not helping you out of kindness. Isabella froze. He knelt in front of her, his dark eyes boring into hers. I'm helping you because you're the only one who can tell me what I need to know. I don't understand, she said, her fear returning full force. The man who fathered your child, Crow said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The traveling merchant, the one who disappeared. Isabella's blood turned to ice. How could he know that? He was a friend of mine, Crow continued, his gaze never leaving her face. And he wasn't a merchant. His name was Marshal John Evans. He was a federal lawman sent to Redemption Creek to investigate something rotten. He leaned closer, his voice so low she could barely hear it over the crackling fire. And he didn't disappear, did he, Isabella? She stared at him, her mind reeling. Marshal Evans, a lawman. It all clicked into place. The town's fear, their desperation to get rid of her. They weren't afraid of a fallen woman. They were afraid of a witness. So you tell me, Crow finished, his voice as sharp as a shard of glass. What did Marshal Evans tell you before the good people of Redemption Creek murdered him? The word hung in the air between them. Murdered. Isabella's world tilted on its axis. The handsome man who had courted her, who had promised her a future, hadn't just abandoned her. He'd been killed, and the entire town was in on it. The banker, the preacher, the sheriff, they were all murderers. She started to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. It wasn't just her life on the line anymore. It was Sophia's. They hadn't cast her out to shame her. They had cast her out to die, to silence her. I didn't know, she choked out, clutching the cloak around her. Crow's expression didn't soften. He must have told you something. He trusted you. Why else would they be so desperate to get rid of you? Isabella squeezed her eyes shut, her mind racing back through the last few weeks of John's life. He had been nervous, secretive. He told her he was working on something big, something that would set them up for life. He told her to trust no one in that town, and he had given her something. For safekeeping, he'd said. Her eyes snapped open. He gave me a package, she whispered. A small leather-bound book. He told me if anything happened to him, it would keep me safe. A flicker of something, triumph, flashed in Crow's eyes. Where is it? He demanded. I hid it, she said, her voice trembling. She glanced down at the sleeping baby in her arms. I knew they were searching my room when I was out. I unstitched the lining of Sophia's swaddling blanket and sewed it inside. For the first time, Crow looked genuinely surprised. He stared at the baby, then back at Isabella, a newfound respect in his eyes. He chose well, Crow said softly. He let out a long breath, some of the tension leaving his powerful frame. My real name is Nathan Crow. I was John's partner. I came to Redemption Creek looking for him. When I saw how they treated you, I knew you were connected. The pieces were all falling into place, forming a picture more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. She wasn't just a victim. She was the keeper of the evidence that could burn that whole town to the ground. And now she was sitting in a camp full of outlaws, led by a man who was just as dangerous as the killer she'd escaped. Could she trust him? She looked at his face, at the hard lines etched by a difficult life. He wasn't a soft man. He wasn't a kind man. But John had trusted him. And right now, he was the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave in the desert. Suddenly, the ears of the horses pricked up. Carlos, the young lookout, stiffened. Riders, he hissed, coming fast from the direction of town. Pete, the scarred veteran, grabbed his rifle. The posse! They must have tracked you. Isabella's heart leaped into her throat. They had come to finish the job, but Nathan didn't look worried. In fact, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He looked out into the darkness, toward the sound of the approaching hoofbeats. They didn't track her, he said, his voice filled with a chilling confidence. I left a trail for them to follow. Isabella stared at him, confused. You led them here? Of course, Nathan said, turning back to her. He drew his pistol, the firelight glinting off the polished steel. It's much easier to deal with vermin when you get them all in one place. He looked at her, and his smile was the scariest thing she had ever seen. This was never a rescue, Isabella, he said. It's an ambush. Hoofbeats thundered through the night, getting closer. 6 riders. Isabella could see their dark shapes against the moonlit horizon. Sheriff Blake was in the lead, flanked by the banker Whitmore and the Reverend Morrison. Their faces were grim, their rifles held at the ready. This wasn't a posse to run her out of the territory. This was a death squad. Nathan's men melted into the rocks around the campsite, becoming invisible shadows. Only Nathan remained in the firelight, standing tall and exposed. He looked completely calm, as if he were waiting for old friends. Isabella scrambled behind a large boulder, shielding Sophia with her body. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She was caught in the middle of a war she never asked for. The posse reined in their horses at the edge of the camp, their mounts snorting nervously. "Crow!" "Oh," Sheriff Blake shouted, his voice tight with false bravado. "We've come for the woman. Hand her over, and we'll let you and your men ride out of here." Nathan let out a short, cold laugh. "That's a generous offer, Sheriff, but I'm afraid she's under my protection now." "She's a sinner and a harlot," Reverend Morrison shrieked, his face contorted with righteous fury. "She has brought shame upon our community." "Shame?" Nathan repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "Is that what you call it? I'd have chosen a different word. Like witness." The air crackled with tension. The sheriff and his men exchanged nervous glances. They hadn't expected this. They had expected a lone, terrified woman, not a confrontation with a known killer. "I don't know what you're talking about," Blake blustered. "Don't you?" Nathan took a step forward. "Let me refresh your memory. It involves a federal marshal named John Evans, a stolen shipment of Union gold, and a town full of hypocrites who got greedy." Whitmore the banker went pale. The Reverend started sputtering about blasphemy. "You see," Nathan continued, his voice carrying in the dead silence, "John sent me a letter before he died. He told me he was close to uncovering the whole rotten scheme. He told me who was involved. He even told me he had a ledger detailing every transaction." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And then he told me he'd found someone he could trust, a good, honest woman who was watching his back." He turned his head and his eyes found Isabella, hidden in the shadows. "He just didn't realize you were all watching her, too." Sheriff Blake finally found his voice. "Lies. All of it. She's a whore who corrupted a good man." "Then why are you so desperate to see her dead?" Nathan shot back. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The posse's facade of righteousness had crumbled, revealing the ugly truth beneath. They were cornered animals, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. "Enough of this," Blake snarled, raising his rifle. "Kill them all. Leave no witnesses." But before he could pull the trigger, a deafening crack echoed from the rocks to his left. It wasn't Nathan's gun. It was Carlos. The sheriff's horse screamed and reared as a bullet tore through the saddle, inches from Blake's leg. Chaos erupted. The night exploded in a symphony of gunfire and shouting. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Isabella pressed herself flat against the ground, covering Sophia's head as the world came apart around them. She saw Pete, the veteran, rise from behind a rock outcropping, his rifle barking twice. Two men from the posse fell from their saddles before they even knew what was happening. Nathan was a whirlwind of lethal motion. He dived behind the campfire, sending a shower of sparks into the air. He fired his pistol twice, his movements economical and precise. The Reverend Morrison clutched his chest, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, and toppled sideways to the ground. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. In less than a minute, it was over. Silence descended, thick and heavy, smelling of gunpowder and blood. 4 men lay dead or dying on the ground. Sheriff Blake and the banker, Whitmore, had wheeled their horses around and were galloping madly back toward the darkness, toward the false safety of their town. Nathan rose slowly, his pistol smoking. He didn't look triumphant. He just looked tired. "We have to move," he said, his voice grim. "They'll be back, with the whole town." Pete and Carlos emerged from the shadows, already gathering their gear. The efficiency of their movements told Isabella this was not the first time they had done this. Isabella stumbled out from behind her rock, her legs shaky. Sophia was crying, frightened by the noise. Isabella tried to soothe her, but her own hands were trembling too much. She had just watched 4 men die. She had seen the man who was protecting her kill without hesitation. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. "Somewhere they won't find us," Nathan said, reloading his pistol. "There's an old Apache stronghold in the canyons to the north. We can hole up there, figure out our next move." Pete nodded in agreement. "Good plan, boss." There's a pass through the red veins that'll get us there by sunrise. It's tight, but it's the fastest way. Nathan looked at the grizzled veteran, his eyes narrowed in thought. The Red Vein Pass. You're sure it's clear? Scouted it myself last year, Pete said with a confident grin. Ain't nobody uses it. We'll be ghosts. Nathan nodded, but a flicker of something unsettled crossed his face. He glanced at Isabella, at the precious cargo she held. They were vulnerable, and they were walking into a landscape of stone and shadow, with only the word of a killer to guide them. They mounted up, Isabella riding with Nathan, Sophia nestled securely between them in the warmth of the beaded cloak. They spurred their horses into the night, leaving the dead where they lay. As they rode, Isabella couldn't shake a feeling of deep unease. The firefight had been too easy. Blake and Whitmore had escaped too cleanly. And the way Pete had suggested the route through the canyons, it felt less like a suggestion and more like he was leading them into a trap. They rode hard through the dying night, the horses' hooves a rhythmic drumming against the rocky ground. The landscape grew more treacherous, the open desert giving way to a maze of narrow canyons and towering rock formations that clawed at the star-dusted sky. This was the Red Veins, a place where a man could disappear forever. Isabella held on to Nathan, the warmth of his body a small comfort against the chilling wind and her own gnawing fear. Sophia had finally cried herself to sleep, her small body trusting and limp against Isabella's chest. This child, this innocent life, was at the center of a storm of violence and greed. The unease that had settled in Isabella's gut was growing with every mile. Pete rode at the head of their small column, guiding them with an unnerving confidence. Every so often he would glance back, and in the pale moonlight, Isabella could see the glint in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a loyal man. It was the look of a wolf leading sheep to the slaughter. She needed to see the ledger. Nathan, she whispered, her lips close to his ear. I need to check on Sophia. Can we stop for a moment? He glanced at her, his face a hard mask. We can't. We need to keep moving. Please, she insisted, injecting a note of panic into her voice. I think she's feverish. Her blanket is too tight. He hesitated. The baby was their weakness, the one thing that could compromise their security. With a curse, he signaled for the group to halt. 5 minutes, he growled. As Nathan kept watch, his rifle sweeping the canyon walls, Isabella dismounted. She fumbled with Sophia's swaddling, her back to Pete and Carlos. Her fingers, numb with cold and fear, worked at the hidden seam. She pulled out the small leather-bound book. Under the pretense of adjusting the baby's clothes, she opened it. The pages were filled with John's neat, precise handwriting, columns of dates, names, and figures. It was the proof Nathan needed, the death warrant for Redemption Creek. As she scanned the entries, one line near the end caught her eye. It was a coded note, something John must have written in his final desperate days. Compromised, trust no one. My partner's contact inside is a veteran. Scarred face, goes by Pete. He's been turned. Isabella's blood ran cold. Pete, the grizzled veteran, the man leading them deeper and deeper into this stone prison. He wasn't their guide. He was their executioner. This canyon wasn't a shortcut to safety. It was the killing ground. She looked up. Pete was watching her. Their eyes met across the short distance, and the friendly mask fell from his face. He knew that she knew. A slow, cruel smile spread across his scarred lips. He subtly shifted his weight in the saddle, his hand drifting down toward his pistol. She had seconds to act. Carlos was checking his horse's hoof, his back to them. Nathan was a dozen feet away, his attention on the shadowy canyon rim above. He couldn't see Pete's expression. He couldn't see the danger they were in. Isabella shoved the ledger back into its hiding place. Her mind was a whirlwind of panic. Shouting a warning would get her shot before the words left her mouth. She had to get to Nathan. Thinking fast, she did the only thing she could. She let out a piercing scream and stumbled forward, pretending to trip over a rock. She fell toward Nathan, shoving Sophia's bundled form into his arms. "The baby!" she shrieked, creating a perfect distraction. As Nathan instinctively turned to secure the child, Isabella didn't stop. She kept moving, grabbing the hunting knife that was sheathed on his belt. She had never held a weapon in her life, but in that moment, instinct took over. "He's a traitor!" she screamed, spinning around just as Pete drew his gun. Pete's gun roared, the sound deafening in the narrow canyon. But he wasn't aiming at Nathan. He was aiming at her. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of her shoulder. The pain was a blinding, white-hot flash. She cried out, stumbling backward, the knife clattering to the ground. Carlos spun around, his face a mask of confusion. Nathan, his face a thundercloud of fury, laid Sophia on the ground and drew his pistol in a single fluid motion. "It's a trap!" Pete yelled, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Suddenly, the rims of the canyon above them sprouted men. Dozens of them. Sheriff Blake and Whitmore were there, along with every man from Redemption Creek who could hold a gun. They had been waiting for them. "You should have stayed in the desert, whore!" Blake bellowed, his face triumphant. "Now you all get to die together." Gunfire erupted from all sides. The canyon became a death trap of ricocheting bullets and flying rock chips. Carlos went down, a red stain spreading across his chest. Isabella, clutching her bleeding shoulder, crawled toward Sophia, trying to shield the screaming baby with her own body. Nathan was pinned down behind a rock, returning fire, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. It was over. They had walked right into their own grave. Pete spurred his horse forward, his gun aimed at Nathan. "It's nothing personal, Crow," he sneered. "They just paid better." He pulled the trigger, but just as he fired, a small, dark object flew through the air and struck him in the face. It was a rock, thrown with desperate strength. Thrown by Isabella, the shot went wide, burying itself in the dirt inches from Nathan's head. The distraction was all Nathan needed. He rose from his cover, his face a mask of cold rage. He fired once. The bullet caught Pete square in the chest, throwing him from his horse. But the reprieve was momentary. The canyon was still filled with gunmen, all of them now turning their attention to the lone warrior and the wounded woman. Nathan looked at Isabella, at the blood soaking her dress, at the terror and defiance in her eyes. He looked at the screaming child. He was out of options, out of time. He mouthed a single word to her, "Run." But there was nowhere to run. The gunmen were closing in, their victory assured. This was the end. Isabella knew it. She could see it in the grim set of Nathan's jaw, in the sheer number of rifles aimed down at them from the canyon rim. They were trapped, wounded, and hopelessly outgunned. She pressed her face against Sophia's tear-streaked cheek, whispering apologies to the tiny daughter she had failed to protect. Sheriff Blake's laughter echoed off the rock walls, a cruel, triumphant sound. "Nowhere left to run, Crow. Give us the ledger, and I might make your deaths quick." Nathan didn't answer. He was down to his last few bullets. He glanced at Isabella, his dark eyes filled with a terrible regret. He had led them here. He had trusted the wrong man. His quest for vengeance for his partner had cost these innocent lives. But as he scanned the canyon walls, looking for any desperate last-ditch option, his eyes caught something. A flicker of movement, not from the sheriff's men, but from a different spot, higher up, deeper in the shadows of the pre-dawn light. He squinted. It wasn't a trick of the light. Figures were moving up there. Silent. Ghostly. They weren't carrying rifles. They were carrying bows. A slow, grim smile touched Nathan's lips. Blake and his men had made a fatal error. They thought this canyon was their territory. They were wrong. This was Comanche land. "You talk too much, Sheriff," Nathan called out, his voice suddenly filled with a chilling confidence that made Blake pause. "You should have learned that silence is a warrior's greatest weapon." Before Blake could ask what he meant, the air filled with a sound like 100 deadly whispers. A volley of arrows descended from the darkness. The men on the canyon rim screamed. They dropped their rifles, clutching at shafts that had sprouted from their chests, their necks, their faces. It was a silent, brutal massacre. Men toppled from their perches, their death cries cut short as they hit the canyon floor. Blake and Whitmore stared in horror, their faces white with terror. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. From the shadows above, dozens of Comanche warriors emerged, their faces painted for war. They moved with a terrifying speed and silence, descending the canyon walls like spirits of vengeance. They were led by a tall, fearsome warrior with a slash of white paint across his eyes. He looked down at Nathan, and their eyes met. The warrior gave a single, sharp nod. Nathan rose to his feet. "Sheriff," he said, his voice dripping with ice, "you're trespassing." The battle, if it could be called that, was over in minutes. The people of Redemption Creek were farmers and shopkeepers, not fighters. They were cut down without mercy. Blake and Whitmore, realizing their doom, threw down their weapons and begged for their lives. The Comanche warriors ignored them. They formed a silent, intimidating circle around Nathan, Isabella, and the baby. The war chief approached, his gaze hard. "You bring trouble to our lands, Nathan Crowfeather," he said in his native tongue. His voice was like stones grinding together. "These white men carry a disease of greed." "They murdered my partner, Stoneheart," Nathan replied in the same language, "and they would have murdered this woman and her child to hide their crimes. The ledger she carries proves their guilt." Isabella watched, not understanding the words but feeling the weight of the moment. She clutched her bleeding shoulder, the pain a dull throb. Stoneheart looked at Isabella, his eyes lingering on the beaded cloak she wore. He recognized the pattern. "The work of your mother," he stated. He then looked at Sophia, and his stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "A child should not know war." He turned his gaze back to the terrified sheriff and banker. "Their crimes are not our concern, but their trespass is. They will be given back to the desert." He gave an order, and two of his warriors dragged the pleading men away into the darkness. Their fate would be slow and agonizing. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the canyon in hues of blood and gold. The battle was over. The dead lay where they had fallen. Stoneheart looked at Nathan one last time. "Your fight is finished. Do not bring it to our lands again." With that, he and his warriors melted back into the rocks, leaving as silently as they had arrived. Silence descended. It was finally over. Nathan walked over to Isabella. He gently examined her shoulder. "The bullet went clean through," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But you'll live." He ripped a piece of cloth from his shirt and began to bandage the wound. She flinched, but not from the pain. She was looking at the body of Carlos, his kind eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. She thought of Pete's betrayal, of the bloody chaos. "This is all my fault," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "All this death, because of me." Nathan stopped what he was doing and cupped her face in his hand, forcing her to look at him. "No," he said, his voice fierce. "This is because of greed, because of evil men. You did nothing but survive. You fought. You were braver than any man I've ever known." He looked down at the blood on her, the dirt on her face, the fire in her amber eyes. The walls he had built around his heart, walls of vengeance and duty, began to crumble. He hadn't just been using her to find his partner's killers. He had come to care for her, to admire her impossible strength. "I wasn't honest with you, Isabella," he confessed, his voice thick with guilt. "I saw you as a means to an end, a key to unlock a puzzle. I put you and your daughter in even more danger." "And you saved us," she replied, her voice soft. "We saved each other." The air between them changed. The chaos of the battle faded away, leaving only the two of them, survivors in a world that had tried to destroy them. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but a profound, desperate relief, a promise of a new beginning, found in the ashes of their past. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. "What now?" he whispered. Isabella looked at Sophia, who was finally sleeping peacefully in the warmth of the Comanche cloak. She looked at the rising sun, which was chasing the last of the shadows from the canyon. Redemption Creek was a town of ghosts now, its dark secret buried with its leaders. The stolen Union gold, mentioned in the ledger, was likely hidden somewhere nearby, a fortune that belonged to no one. "Now," she said, a small, determined smile touching her lips for the first time, "we choose freedom." She had walked out of Redemption Creek a pariah, a victim, but she would not be defined by what they had tried to do to her. She was a mother, a fighter, a survivor, and her story was just beginning. They found the gold exactly where the ledger said it would be, hidden in an old abandoned mine shaft not far from the canyon. It was more money than Isabella could have ever imagined, a fortune built on lies and paid for with blood. They buried Carlos under a pile of stones, a simple grave for a man who had died for a cause he barely understood. Then, they took what supplies they could and turned their backs on the red veins forever. They rode east toward the rising sun, putting the desert and its ghosts behind them. Nathan was quiet, the weight of his partner's death and the violence he had wrought settling heavily on him. Isabella, despite the pain in her shoulder, felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in over a year. They stopped a week later in a small, quiet town in Kansas, a place where no one knew their names. Nathan used a small portion of the gold to buy them clean clothes, a room at the best hotel, and a hot meal. He hired a doctor to properly tend to Isabella's wound. That night, as Sophia slept in a real cradle for the first time in her life, Isabella stood with Nathan on the balcony of their room, looking out at the peaceful streetlights. "It feels like another world," she said softly. "It is," Nathan replied. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a witness or a liability, but as the woman who had thrown a rock to save his life. "The money is yours, Isabella. All of it. It's what John would have wanted. You and Sophia can start over. Go anywhere you want. Be anyone you want." Her heart ached at his words. He was offering her an escape. He was offering to walk away. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Where will you go?" He shrugged, looking out at the horizon. "There are always more wrongs to right. It's the only life I know." Isabella reached out and took his hand. It was rough and calloused, the hand of a killer, but it was also the hand that had steadied her, protected her. "What if I don't want to go anywhere without you?" she said, her amber eyes searching his. "What if the life we want is one we build together?" He stared at her, a storm of emotions crossing his face. Hope, fear, disbelief. He was a man of two worlds belonging to neither, a man of violence and shadows. What could he possibly offer a woman like her? "I'm not a good man, Isabella," he said, his voice raw. "You were good to me," she countered. "You were good to my daughter. The world is full of men who call themselves good and do terrible things. I'd rather have a man who knows the darkness, but chooses the light." She stood on her toes and kissed him, and this time it was a kiss of passion, of promise, of a future she was brave enough to claim. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and for the first time in his life, Nathan Crowfeather felt like he was home. They decided to head west to California, a place where the world was new and a person's past didn't have to define their future. They would be the Martinez family, a quiet, respectable couple with a beautiful baby girl. No one would ever need to know about the fire and blood that had forged their bond. As they prepared to leave, Isabella took the beaded cloak, the one that had belonged to Nathan's mother. She carefully folded it and placed it at the bottom of her trunk. It had been a shield, a symbol of protection in her darkest hour. Now it would be a reminder that sometimes hope is found in the most unexpected places, and that true redemption isn't found in a town's name, but in the courage to choose love over fear. Their journey was just beginning, but they would face it together. A family born not of blood, but of choice, riding toward a future as bright and endless as the western sky. This story is about more than just survival. It's about the truth that your past doesn't get to write your future. Isabella was branded and cast out, but she refused to let the world's judgment be the final word on her story. Maybe you felt like that. Maybe you've been misjudged or cornered or felt like there was nowhere left to run. But just like Isabella, you have a strength inside you that is greater than any challenge you face. If you believe in second chances, in the power of unexpected kindness, and in fighting for the future you deserve, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and join our community. Because every story we share is a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, the sun will always rise. And you never know when a protector is waiting just beyond the firelight.